Good evening, Harrison Park students and families. So this is night number 3 of our bedtime stories. Before I begin, just a reminder that tomorrow there will be lunch, the last day for this week. I don't believe that there is lunch next week, but we'll let you know if anything changes. So that's from 11 to 1, and remember to keep your distance when you go there and pick up your food. Our food bank is also open from 3:30 to 4:30 in the parking lot by the cafeteria. One assignment I have for you tonight was supposed to be our multicultural night, and you know that that's a really big deal, and it's a celebration of all the different cultures that we have at Harrison Park. So what I'd like you to do is spend some time asking your parents or your family members about how they got into to the United States. What brought them there? How did they get there? Because we know that most people came from somewhere else when we're talking about the United States. So I can tell you that in my family, my dad came to from Mexico when he was 8 years old with his mom and his little brother, and then they grew up here in Portland after that. And her family's been around for a long time. They came from England many, many, many years ago. So that's how my family came to the United States. You might ask a lot more questions because I have a lot of stories to tell about my dad. Tonight I'm going to read Mr. Peabody's Apples. This is a story by Madonna. I used to teach this book when I was a language arts teacher for my middle schoolers. So middle schoolers, tonight you might get something out of this as well. So Mr. Peabody's Apples by Madonna. It's got really nice pictures too. They're playing baseball, and you guys know I love baseball. In the town of Hatville, which wasn't a very big town, Mr. Peabody was congratulating his Little League team on a great game. They had not won, but one really great game. I need to read it this way. They had not won, but no one really cared because they'd had such a good time playing. Mr. Peabody was the history teacher at the local elementary school, and in the summertime, he dedicated every Saturday to organizing baseball games with other schools. Billy Little, who wasn't a very big boy, was one of Mr. Peabody's students. He loved baseball more than anything, and he thought Mr. Peabody was the greatest. After each game, he would always stay to help pick up the bats and balls, and then when he was finished, Mr. Peabody would smile and say, "Thanks, Billy, good job. I'll see you next Saturday." Then he would start his walk home along the main street of Hatville, which wasn't a very big street, waving hello to everyone he knew, and everyone would wave back. Along the way, he always passed Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market. Here, Mr. Peabody would stop and admire Mr. Funkadeli's fresh apples. He would pick out the shiniest apple, drop it in his bag, and to continue on his way. Across the street, Tommy Tittlebottom watched with curiosity as Mr. Peabody walked away with the apple. "That's strange," Tommy said to himself. "Mr. Peabody didn't pay anyone for the apple." Tommy got out his skateboard and rushed to tell his friend. The following Saturday, Mr. Peabody's team played another game, and they lost, as usual. But no one seemed to care because they'd had such a great time playing. Billy picked up the balls and bats, and Mr. Peabody set off on his walk home. He waved to everyone he knew, and they waved back, and once again he stopped outside Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market, picked up the shiniest apple, dropped it in his bag, and continued on his way. Across the street, Tommy Tittlebottom and his friends watched Mr. Peabody and were amazed at what they saw. Mr. Peabody had not paid for this apple. They couldn't wait to tell all of their friends, who told their parents, who told their neighbors, who told their friends in the town of Hatville, which wasn't a very big town. That Saturday, the Saturday after that, Mr. Peabody was standing all alone on the baseball field, wondering where everybody was. Then he saw Billy walking toward him with a sad look on his face. "Hello, Billy, I'm glad you're here, but where is the rest of the team?" asked Mr. Peabody. Billy remained silent. "What is it, Billy?" he asked. Billy didn't look up. "Everybody thinks you're a thief," he said to the ground. Mr. Peabody looked confused. He took off his hat and scratched his head. "Who says I'm a thief, Billy? And what did I steal?" he asked. "Tommy Tittlebottom and his friends said they saw you take an apple from Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market twice, and they said you didn't pay for them," answered Billy. Ah, said Mr. Peabody, putting his hat back on his head. Let's go talk to Mr. Funkadelic about it, shall we? That's Billy, and he looks pretty sad that nobody's playing. They walked down the main street, which wasn't a very big street, and Mr. Peabody waved to all the people he knew. But now some of them did not wave back, and some pretended they didn't even see him. They finally arrived at Mr. Funkadelic's fruit market. Out popped Mr. Funkadelic, who said, "Hey, what are you doing here, Mr. Peabody? Why aren't you at the game?" "There wasn't a game today," said Mr. Peabody, "and I was wondering if I could take my apple earlier than usual." "Sure, why not?" replied Mr. Funkadelic. "You paid for them every Saturday morning when you pick up your milk. You can take them when you like. You want the big shiny one, Mr. Peabody?" Mr. Peabody took his apple, smiled, and offered it to Billy. "I would like to take the apple, Mr. Peabody, but I have to go and find Tommy and explain everything to Billy." "When you find him, ask him to come over to my house. I would like to speak to him too," said Mr. Peabody. So what do you think is going on? That's interesting. So he's paying for the apple, but people don't know that, and they jumped to some conclusions, which can get people into trouble sometimes. A little while later, Billy found Tommy and told him what had happened with the apples. He told Tommy that Mr. Peabody wanted to speak to him right away. So off Tommy ran, and when he arrived, he rang the doorbell, and Mr. Peabody came to the door. They looked at each other for a while. "Oh dear, Mr. Peabody," said Tommy on the doorstep. "I didn't understand. I should not have said what I said, but it looked like you hadn't paid for the apples." Mr. Peabody's eyebrows went up a little. He felt a warm breeze across his face. "It doesn't matter what it looked like. What matters is the truth." Tommy looked down at his shoes and he said, "I am so sorry. What can I do to make things better now?" Mr. Peabody took a deep breath, looked up at a small cloud that was in the sky and said, "I'll tell you what, Tommy. Meet me at the baseball diamond in 1 hour and bring a pillow stuffed with feathers." "Okay," said Tommy, who ran off to his house to find a pillow. Why would he need a pillow? That's kind of weird. About an hour later, Tommy met Mr. Peabody on the pitcher's mound. "Hello, Tommy," said Mr. Peabody. "Follow me and bring your pillow." Tommy followed Mr. Peabody to the top of the bleachers, wondering what it was all about. "It's a windy day, isn't it?" asked Mr. Peabody when they reached the top. Tommy nodded his head in agreement. Here's a pair of scissors. Now cut the pillow in half and shake the feathers out." Tommy looked confused, but did it anyway. He thought it was a small price to pay to gain Mr. Peabody's forgiveness. The wind carried the thousands of feathers far and wide. There they are, blowing away. That's going to make a mess. I wonder how they're going to clean that up. Tommy looked relieved, and he said, Is that all I have to do to make things better?" "There's one more thing," Mr. Peabody said. "Now you must go and pick up all the feathers." Tommy frowned. "I don't think it's possible to pick up all the feathers," Tommy replied. "It would be just as impossible to undo the damage that you have done by spreading a rumor that I am a thief," said Mr. Peabody. "Each feather represents a person in Hatfill." Ah, now I get it. All of those feathers represent a person? It's going to be impossible to pick up those feathers. There was a long pause as Tommy began to understand what Mr. Peabody was saying. Finally, he said, "I guess I have a lot of work ahead of me." Mr. Peabody smiled and said, "Indeed you do. Next time, don't be so quick to judge a person and remember the power of your words." Then he handed Tommy the shiny red apple and made his way home. The end. So I wonder how he solved that problem. I wonder what he did. You can see he sewed up the pillow and he picked up all those feathers. That must have taken a long time. So I think the important thing to remember here is we have to really be careful to jump to conclusions and make sure we know everything before we start telling people maybe rumors or things that we don't really understand. I hope you're doing well. We will definitely be in touch, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Good night.